Hey y'all, I'm really excited to be here. My in-laws all live in Nashville and most of them went to Lipscomb University. So even though I didn't go here, I married into a Bison family and definitely feel like I'm a Bison fan at this point. I am now 28 years old, but 8 years ago, I was sitting basically in the same seat that a lot of you are. I was a 21-year-old, I was about to graduate from college, and I had absolutely no clue what I was supposed to do with my life. I didn't know what job I wanted to have. I knew certain gifts and talents God had given me, but they didn't really make sense in the workforce, and I needed time to figure out what it was I was supposed to do. Now, I had grown up in the mountains of western North Carolina, and I had heard about this thing called the Appalachian Trail. And I didn't know much about it, but I knew it was 2,180 miles long. It goes through 14 separate states, and I knew that if you wanted to hike the entire trail all at once, that typically it took between 4 and 6 months. So I thought to myself, perfect. That's just enough time for me to figure out what it is I'm supposed to do with my life. So I graduated from college in December, and that following March, I started out on my own on the Appalachian Trail. The problem was I didn't have any backpacking experience. But hey, I didn't think that was a problem because I had been an athlete my whole life, and I had gone on day hikes, and I had all my brother's old Boy Scout gear, so who needed experience, right? I mean, the Appalachian Trail was going to be fun. It was going to be an adventure, and hey, it was just walking, so it was going to be easy, right? Well, starting out in March, I realized very early on that it was not going to be easy. Hiking up and down mountains all day long with a 30-pound pack on your back and blisters on your feet is very difficult. To add to that, the trail in March in the mountains of North Georgia is freezing cold. And almost every other day there'd be snow flurries, and I wasn't accustomed to sleeping outside in freezing weather, and it was so tough. I realized within the first 2 weeks that this was going to be the most difficult thing I had ever done in my entire life. And I remember very specifically 2 weeks into the trip, waking up in my tent one morning and hearing the sound of cold rain outside. And cold rain is the worst. It's worse than the snow flurries because snow will bounce off you, but rain just saturates you. It saturates you, it saturates your tent, it makes your pack twice as heavy. And the last thing I wanted to do that morning was crawl out of my tent and start walking in the rain. But they have this saying on the Appalachian Trail that goes, no rain, no Maine. That means if you don't hike in the rain, you don't make it to Maine. So in my head, I thought, no rain, no Maine, no rain, no Maine, and okay, I'm ready. I crawled out of my tent, I packed everything up, I started walking, but I was just dragging my feet, and I got hungry, so I pulled out an energy bar, but it was so cold that the energy bar was frozen solid. I couldn't bite into it, so I just started licking it. So there I was, walking down the trail, licking my energy bar. And later that day, the cold, drizzly rain actually turned into a lightning and thunderstorm. And this was my first lightning and thunderstorm on the trail, and I was terrified because all of a sudden I realized there's metal in my hiking poles, there's metal in my packs. What am I gonna do? Well, thankfully, along the AT, there are shelters. They're not glamorous. They're basically 3-sided wooden buildings, but they have a tin roof, and they'll keep you dry and safe in a storm. So at that point, I start running up the trail as quickly as I can to get to the next shelter. I make it, it's packed full of hikers, but they're all male hikers, and they decide to make a small space in the middle for a poor, wet, pathetic female. And I think, I'll take it. You know, I'm safe. So I take off my pack, and I dig inside, and I bring out a trash bag that has my one set of dry clothes that I can wear at night, and then I go around to the back of the shelter where I can change in privacy. So I'm back behind the shelter, and I'm hugging up against this thin strip of roof, trying to stay dry. And as I'm taking off a wet top off my body and reaching my hands towards the sky, a lightning bolt actually hits the roof of the shelter and then goes through my body to the ground. I was struck by lightning. Being struck by lightning really hurts. But I will say there are two advantages to being struck by lightning. One is you don't know it's going to happen, and two, it happens very quickly. So literally, by the time I could figure out what had just occurred, the pain had already left my body. But I was still terrified, and so immediately I did an inventory. Okay, I can wiggle my toes. I still got 10 fingers. I took a deep breath. And at that point, instead of being worried, I thought to myself, cool, I was 21 and I really didn't know any better. And so instead of being worried about heart arrhythmia or instead of seeking immediate medical attention, I thought to myself, well, gosh, maybe I'll get a blonde streak in my hair or different colored eyes or the gift of telepathy. I wasn't sure, but I was not deterred. And the next day I just kept hiking. Now, a week later, I made it to the Smoky Mountain National Park, and I was so excited to be there because my whole life I had heard about how beautiful the Smokies are. It's the most visited national park in the entire country. But the entire time I was in the park, it was like walking through a cloud. It was gray, it was misty, it was either raining or spitting rain the entire time. And my last night in the park, I was staying at Tri-Corner Knob Shelter, which is about 6,000 feet above sea level. And I remember going to sleep that night, listening to the rain hit the tin roof and shivering in my sleeping bag. And the next morning I woke up and the first thought that went through my head was, thank you, God, I don't hear rain on the shelter roof anymore. It must have stopped. But then I looked outside and what did I see? Snow. There was 6 inches of snow on the ground, and it was coming down in blizzard-like conditions. And I was terrified, and all of a sudden I remembered these newspaper articles that come out every spring talking about the hikers that have to get rescued out of the Smokies. And I thought, my mother is going to kill me. I have got to get out of here. And so I look for my shoes and I find them and the laces are covered in ice, so I slip them on and I throw on my pack and I start hiking as quickly as I can to try to get out of the Smokies. And I know, based on my guidebook, that from that point I have 18 miles almost entirely downhill to get out of the park and get to a road where there's a hiker hostel, and I knew I would be safe there. So I was going as quickly as I could, and thankfully, most of the time, the trail stayed within the forest. So I was somewhat protected from the wind and the sleet and the snow coming down. But at one point, the trail left the forest and went onto a long exposed ridgeline, and as soon as I left the tree cover, I felt the wind and the snow hit my face, and it burned. And I had to duck my head and close my eye and walk as quickly as I could to get back into tree cover. But then when I made it there, I immediately lifted my head and I couldn't open my eye. It had frozen shut. And I had to stand there and pick icicles off of my eyelashes and wipe frozen crust out of the corner of my eye until I could once again open it, regain my sight, and keep hiking down the mountain. Now, thankfully, I made it out of the Smokies, and with all that bad weather in the beginning, you can imagine that as the weeks passed and the weather started to get better, and finally I started to see wildflowers come up along the trail, I was elated. I was relieved. And the entire hike, I kept a journal. And one night in particular, I was on top of Roan Mountain, which is one of the most beautiful places on the entire trail, and it felt magical. It felt divine. I want to share with you what I wrote in my journal from that day. The sky was lit up with strong hues of orange, pink, and yellow that could never be expressed by a crown. And as the sun set, the mountains shed their shades of blue to reveal a deep purple. I was overcome with awe. Spontaneously and without thought, I shouted, "Praise God!" into the wind. Then I felt like a dork. I had become comfortable singing out loud on the trail, but shouting loud phrases into the wind to a God whom most folks rejected on the trail, well, it felt weird. I hadn't meant to think so much about God on the trail. I wasn't really counting on him to challenge me or to change me out here. I thought we would just retain the status quo until I finished in Maine and started going back to church. But this evening, with the sunset, the colors, and the scent of the mountains and the noise of the crickets, I knew that God had planned it out for me. I remembered a verse in the Bible that said, even if the humans failed to praise God, then the rocks would sing out his glories. And that's what they were doing. The mountains were singing the praises of God beautifully and without shame. I wished I could be more like a mountain. The trail very quickly for me not only became a physical journey, but a spiritual journey as well. Because I was out there by myself and I didn't have my normal support network of friends or family, I always turned to God. If I was thinking something, I turned to God. If I wanted to have a conversation, I turned to God. If I was scared, I prayed about it. If I was in awe, I gave thanksgiving. The Appalachian Trail for me became like a walking prayer. But throughout that, I was always a little intimidated of the other hikers around me. The trail in general is a very liberal community. And there are about 2,000 hikers who try to hike the entire length of the Appalachian Trail each year. And they're all different ages, they have different backgrounds and different beliefs. And at first I was sort of nervous to encounter these strangers out in the woods. In fact, I remember journaling about that as well. This is what I said. It's not that there weren't Christians on the Appalachian Trail. There were. But Christians are the bears of the Appalachian Trail. You might run across a handful on your way to Maine. Left-wing anti-fundamentalists are the squirrels of the trail. So you are guaranteed to encounter several every day. As a bear, I was scared of squirrels because they were scared of me. They kept their distance and feared I would eat them, when really I just wanted to dine on berries and live peaceably in the woods. I was a bear trying to look like a groundhog. Groundhogs were a lot less threatening than bears, plus they were cute. You'd be crazy not to like a groundhog. But the neat thing on the trail was when I met these other hikers and started to have conversations with them, I began to learn that the trail is one place in life where you don't have labels. Usually in society, when we meet people, we think of them in terms of what they are, what they do, what they believe. But on the trail, you really got to know people for who they are. On the trail, there aren't a lot of distractions. You don't have a cell phone, you don't have a television going off, you don't have homework or work commitments. So when you spend time with someone, it's quality time. And I remember meeting certain hikers along the way, and I would walk with them for an afternoon or a full day, and spending just that amount of time with them without any external distractions, I felt like I knew them as well as some people I had known my entire life. And slowly and surely, I began to love to meet the other hikers on the trail and spend time with them, especially because a large demographic on the trail are people who have recently retired. And here I was as a 21-year-old, not knowing what it was I wanted to do with my life, and I could ask these 60-year-olds all about their life, about their work, about their history. So I really enjoyed that, but occasionally I would come across a hiker that I didn't want to spend time with. And there was one point in Virginia, I met a young man around my age who he decided that he really wanted to hike with me. The problem was, I really didn't want to hike with him, but I was a good Southern girl. I wasn't going to be real direct and hurt his feelings. I was just going to leave him some verbal clues so he knew how I felt. So I said things to this hiker such as, gosh, I really like hiking by myself. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, me too. And then he kept following me. So I said, gee, I'm really glad I don't have a hiking partner. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, me too. And then he kept following me. For the next several days, he followed me. And I tried to speed up and hike fast to get away. But he kept up. I tried to slow down so he would get bored and want to keep going, but he simply decelerated. So finally, after 5 full days of this, there was a brief break where I didn't see him directly behind me on the trail, and I thought to myself, this is it. This is my chance. I have got to escape. And what do you do if you're trying to escape from someone on the Appalachian Trail? Well, it became very clear to me at that point that I needed to run off the trail and hide underneath a rhododendron tree. So that's exactly what I did. I sprinted off the trail, I got on all fours, I crawled underneath a rhododendron tree, and it was while I was laying there with my face pressed against the earth, looking up, praying that this guy would pass without seeing me, that I realized this is the most pathetic I have ever felt in my entire life. I was out there trying to avoid the only human contact within miles, all because I couldn't be direct and blunt with him from the very beginning. So I promised myself right then and there that from that point forward, I would always be direct, even if it meant I was going to hurt someone's feeling on the trail. And thankfully, I have never had that problem again. Now, by the time I got to Pennsylvania, I was so excited because I had hiked over 1,000 miles to get there. 1,000 miles. That seemed impossible before I started. But I was also completely deflated because I had come 1,000 miles and it had been the hardest thing I had ever done in my entire life, and I still had over 1,000 miles left to go. To add to that, Pennsylvania is a very difficult state. The trail in Pennsylvania is extremely rocky. It's like all the other states took all their rocks and just dumped them on the trail in Pennsylvania. So not only do your feet hurt from walking on these sharp, jagged edges, but your neck hurts from constantly having to look down all day, hoping that you won't sprain one of your ankles. The entire time I was in Pennsylvania, I told myself, I just have to get out of Pennsylvania. I just have to get out of the rocks. Things will get better when I get to New Jersey. But then I got to New Jersey, and I had my hardest day of the entire hike and one of the hardest days of my life. And something really tragic and really unfortunate happened. I woke up one morning and was hiking along the trail, and I came to the top of a mountain where there was an open-air pavilion, and there's also an access road from a nearby town leading up to that building. Well, within an hour of when I arrived at that pavilion, someone had driven up from the nearby town and committed suicide. And I was the first person to find the body, and I had no clue whether it was a suicide, whether it was a murder, whether someone was there who was going to come and hurt me. I just remember feeling like my stomach dropped out of my body. I turned, I ran back down the trail. It felt like everything was moving in slow motion. But after going about a half a mile, I took out a cell phone that I had been carrying, and I looked, and I had service, and I called 911. And the police came out, and they met me, and they sat me down, and they comforted me, and then they asked me questions for about 30 minutes. And after they were done with their questions, they said, "Okay, you can keep hiking now." Keep hiking? I was traumatized. I mean, I was away from all my friends, all my family. I had just come face to face with death. I was scared. I was worried about my safety. I began to question whether or not I should be out here on the trail doing this. But without really thinking through the options, I just kept hiking. And looking back, I think it was one of the best things I could have done. In society, when bad things happen, one of our immediate responses is to try to fill our schedule and fill our time so we don't have to think about what just happened. On the trail, I had to think about it, and I had to pray through it. I was turning to God, and I remember a night or two after I had that event happen, I was in a shelter all by myself, and I was terrified. And so I turned to God. There's never any doubt in my mind that God hears my prayers. I never worry that he is not listening. It was never about whether or not he was listening. It was just about how he would respond. That night, I never felt comforted. I continued to feel scared and alone, and I slept in fits of fear. But in the morning, things were different. I awoke to discover the sun rising above the distant mountains and green fields below. I was still in a haze when I first saw it, but I immediately tried to find my camera because it was so beautiful, I wanted to save it. The entire sky was glowing with radiant rose-colored hues and bright orange highlights, and the air around me seemed to be painted with an artist's touch. I felt like God had designed this moment just for me. He was communicating to me through the sunrise. The pink said, "I am here." The orange said, "I am going with you." And the gold, the bright gold, said, "Trust in me." I kept going down the trail, and God encouraged me in so many ways, not just through creation, but through the other hikers around me. It was phenomenal how other people on the trail who had heard what happened on my hike decided to reach out to me. They gave me space if I wanted space. They offered company if I wanted company. A lot of hikers even offered me their food, which thru hikers never offer other thru hikers food. So I knew it was special, and I felt loved, and I felt safe. But after that whole experience, I also felt like the trail owed me something. I mean, after that, I deserved a red carpet leading all the way to Maine, right? So when I got to Massachusetts, and the first day there, I had 140 mosquito bites. And then I got to Vermont and learned that mosquitoes weren't even the worst insect. It's actually black flies that will drive you crazy. I was getting pretty frustrated. I mean, the trail remained difficult, and it took until Vermont for me to realize the trail is innately hard. And that wasn't going to change. I wasn't in control of the terrain. I wasn't in control of the weather. I wasn't in control of the bugs. The only thing I was in control of was my attitude. And so at that point, I stopped trying to fight the trail. I stopped trying to be in control, and I began to flow with the trail, and I learned how to enjoy it. And that made all the difference in the last few hundred miles. Even though New Hampshire and Maine are the most difficult 2 states on the trail, for me, they were also the most enjoyable. And I remember getting to that last mountain in Maine, and I was a different person than the girl who had started the trail. The only thing I felt more certain of, though, at the end of this journey was myself. I was no longer defined as a resume or by my activities, and I didn't cater my words and actions to create a positive public perception. I felt like for the first time in my life, I really knew who I was. I definitely believed in God. That probably stood out the most after 2,100 miles. Every day on the trail, I felt God's presence, his promise to never leave me, and his power in all creation. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I needed to hide or apologize for it. My affection for other hikers and their acceptance of me helped me realize that regardless of faith and background, if you get to know other people, not what they are, but who they are, then you will allow yourself to love better and to be loved. By the end of the journey, a lot of my values in life had changed. I now valued simplicity. I valued quality relationships. I longed for hard physical outdoor labor. And it's so funny because I think so many times in life we are trying to discern what path God has for us in the future when in the present we're right where he wants us. And on the trail I learned that was where God wanted me. So after my journey, I got a job, but I immediately started saving up time and saving up money to take more adventures. And at this point, I want to show a quick slideshow to you of some of my favorite places, favorite hikes, and favorite adventures that God has led me down. So at this point, I've hiked over 11,000 miles on 6 different continents. I've completed the Pacific Crest Trail, which runs from Mexico to Canada and is actually 400 miles longer than the Appalachian Trail. I have the fastest women's time on the Long Trail in Vermont, which is the country's oldest long-distance trail. In 2008, I got married, and since then, I've done over 5,000 miles with my husband. This past summer, we went back to the Appalachian Trail with the goal of setting the overall record. I hiked between 15 and 16 hours every day. I usually only got about 6 hours of sleep at night. I saw 36 bears this past summer. I saw 12 moose. I finished the trail in 46 and a half days, which is 26 hours faster than the previous record, and I averaged 46.93 miles per day. Yeah, it's pretty impressive, but the thing is, it's not about the numbers. It's never about the numbers. It's not about how fast you go. It's not about how far you go. It's what you take from the experience. And every single trail that I've traveled down has brought me closer to God and has revealed something new and something amazing to me through creation. So I want to encourage all of you, make time for adventure and make time for creation. So often we think the places where we draw near to God are through church and through the Bible, which is true, but God's language and his beauty is all around us. And on that note, I want to end with one final Bible verse, which is Job 12:7-10. Ask the animals, they will teach you, or the birds of the air, and they will tell you. Or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, or let the fish of the sea inform you. Which of these does not know what the hand of the Lord has done? In his hand is the life of every creature and the breath of all mankind. Thank you so much.